On today's episode of Dream Farm, we're going to be talking about how to manage wild orchards. And this farm is blessed with about 15 acres of scattered wild apple trees. And we've been working on these areas for the past couple of years. So we're going to talk about that today. Dream Farm is brought to you by Whitetail Institute, Research Equals Results. Hunt Stand Pro Whitetail App. Hoyt Archery, Stealth Cam Trail Cameras, and PH Outdoors Food Plot Drills. If you look at all these rose bushes closely, you'll see that almost every one of them has an apple tree coming up in it. This one's pretty obvious, but just as we go through here, just one after another, and I think, and it was actually the district forester that put it in my mind, is that you say the chicken or the egg. So which came first, the multiflora rose bush or the apple tree? Was the apple tree there, then the rose bush grew up and protected the tree? Or was the multiflora rose bush there, the birds sat on it and created the apple tree? He was under the impression that it's probably the rose bush was there, the apple tree came in as a result. But either way, it's almost like they're beneficial to each other. So you have to be careful. You don't get too aggressive on releasing these little trees, because that might be the protector that you're killing. In this part of the wild orchard, Ben had come in here last July with the skid steer doing just what we're going to do today. He had pulled the rows away from all of these trees. So this one is an example of what they would look like if they're cleaned up. And you can see these are doing pretty good. I mean, these were bigger trees though, obviously. We weren't dealing with little small, 5-foot tall trees. We're dealing with big trees. But pulling the rows away from those, that made a lot of sense, looking back on it now, because these trees are flourishing. They're doing really well. And ideally, this is what we would do. We would let the little ones stay in their protection from the rose bushes or whatever other, weed trees might be around them, and then release them once they get big enough that they can take the deer pressure. This is an example of what I was talking about, where the multiflora rose right here is protecting the crab apple, and that's right here. So this is just a perfect example of probably the way nature's doing this. The birds come, sit on the multiflora rose. They've been eating the apples, so they've got seeds in their digestive tract. They pass them through. You get apple trees coming up right in these multiflora rose bushes. But the ones that are out in the open, and there's plenty of them, they don't have anything to protect them. So once they start to get a little bit of size to them, the deer start eating them and they start rubbing on them. And that's really hard on these little trees. So, to release them all is not a very good idea. So we're only releasing the big ones from the multiflora rose, the ones that can handle the deer rubbing on them and browsing on them. This is an example of an apple tree that the deer keep browsing on. It turns into a bush. It can't go up, so it keeps going out. And you can see how they've nipped off the fresh growth all the way around this tree. There will be some of these that get away from them, but not very many. The ones that are going to get past the deer are going to be the ones that are in these multiflora rose bushes. This is the perfect example of a challenging decision as we talk about how to release or how to manage some of these wild apple trees. There's a wild apple tree right in the middle of this massive multiflora rose bush. There's no way anything is going in there. Let's see if I can even get to it without getting myself all poked to bits here. Well, you can see it, that taller stem. That's an apple tree. So it'd be tempting to want to come in here and take this bush out of here. But as soon as we did that, that would leave one little apple tree with a trunk about 1/2 inch to 1 inch in diameter. Every buck that walked past here is going to rub on that. This is an example of one of those small trees that we pulled the rose bush away from. And you can see the bucks have been working on it, rubbed it all up. It's dead now. I mean, there are still some sprouts coming up from the stump. So there's going to be another apple tree here, but this one got abused pretty bad. This is one of the trees that Ben pulled all the rose from last year. In fact, the rose pile is still laying right here. But you can see this one's really benefiting. It's a pretty good sized tree. I don't know how many years old it is. I'm sure it's pretty old tree, but now it's producing apples. Whereas, who knows, without a little bit extra help, where it would be in that cycle. The tree behind me brings up another discussion. I pruned this one, and I've talked with some experts since, and the jury's kind of out on whether or not to prune these wild trees. Most people say no. If they're small, maybe, but once they get that, several years of growth, it's probably going to hurt them more than it's going to help them, because nature has figured out how to make these things productive. And one of the main reasons people prune apple trees is so that they bear fruit every year. You're taking some of the growth out so it can, put more energy into producing apples. But what nature does is called alternate bearing. And it's not going to produce apples every single year. These wild trees aren't. And if you don't prune them, it's not going to make any real difference. In fact, you might have more apples on the alternate years when you do get apples if you don't prune it than if you do. The only thing that makes sense is to cut the dead wood out, make a little bit more room in there for the air to move through. But anyway, the point is they bear every other year. So you might have a tree that does really, really well, and you think, man, that's going to be awesome. I'm going to come back here and hunt this spot next year. Well, next year there might not be any apples on that tree. Then the year after, it might be loaded again, or it might be half full, and then year 3, it might be loaded. Like I said, you can look it up online. It's called alternate bearing. If you want the trees to bear every year, you probably need to start pruning them when they're fairly small and get them into that, more of a consistent cycle. Nature doesn't do it that way. And I'm totally satisfied with not doing the pruning work. I'm happy to let nature run its course with these trees. So I'm not going to prune any more of these wild trees, and just let nature do it the way that it's intended. This tree behind me is the poster child for alternate bearing. 2 years ago, this thing was absolutely loaded with apples. In fact, this was one of the apple trees on this farm that did produce apples that tasted good. So that was pretty cool. We took a bunch of them back, made pies and stuff out of them. But last year there were no apples on it, none. And then this year, you can see it's just loaded up again. I'll bet you 2 years ago, one of the branches broke off. There were so many apples on it. This year, I'll bet you it'll be the same thing again. It's completely full of these little bitty apples that are going to continue to grow and get bigger. Also, this is one of the spots that I came into, would have been last winter, late last winter, 2024, and cut back a bunch of the junk trees that were around this on the tree side. Gets full sunlight facing to the east, but it was complete shadow going west. So I opened all of that up. So that should hopefully benefit now, not only just from the standpoint of this is the year that it bears, but now it's got even more sunlight because of that. And I do think that you've got to release them at some point. You got to give them more sunlight, you got to give them more nutrients, more water. That's the whole balance is exactly when do you do that and how do you go about it? How aggressively do you go in and work on these trees? Behind me is another case for letting nature run its course and do all the management. There's an apple tree tucked right into the edge of the timber back here, loaded up with apples. I'm not sure that we could do any better if we cut all the trees away from it and let the full sunlight hit that tree than what it's doing right now. It's adapted to growing out, away from the timber, out to find sunlight. And it's figured out how to produce a lot of apples, even though from probably early afternoon on, it's not getting any sun. In this spot, I cut down a bunch of these hickory trees that were shading the apple trees along this edge of the timber. I think that's a good practice. I've heard people talk about, that can be harmful to these full-grown trees if you throw a whole bunch of sunlight on them all of a sudden and they're not used to it. And we'll look at some more spots like this, but it doesn't seem to have affected these trees. I bet I cut down probably 20 or 30 of these little small hickory trees in behind me, and that opened up, like I said, a lot more sunlight on these trees along the edge. So you got to do what you can to help them, but you don't necessarily want to go into a full-blown pruning project. Believe it or not, this is an apple tree right back in this little hickory grove. I'm sure the apple tree started first. The apple tree is older than these little hickory trees that have moved in around it, but you can see that it's just not productive at all. There's no branches at the lower level. There aren't any apples on it. You get a little bit of green toward the top. I'm not sure if I even cut these hickories back if that tree is even savable. It might be too late, but I do think that over the course of the next few years, I'm going to go ahead and cut these hickories back anyway, because even as you look at it, there's nothing growing. We've talked about TSI a lot on the Dream Farm series, but this is a perfect example of why it's so important. There's nothing growing under these hickories. Just a little bit of grass, that's it. I mean, there's no browse, no food, no cover. So removing and making a pocket of sunlight here not only would maybe benefit this apple tree, but definitely would make this into a better habitat on this little area. This is going to be another one of my topics that might be ongoing in this wild orchard, and that's what they call top working or grafting. And I tried, I don't know how many different grafts I tried last late winter, early spring, probably a couple dozen anyway. And I know there were one or two that survived. I'm not sure where they're at. We'll probably find them eventually. But this is an example of 4 of them that failed. And you can see how they failed. Basically what I think happened was they dried out. I didn't waterproof the grafts well enough so that we hit a week, let's say with no rain or no moisture, and then this whole union just dried out and died. So it didn't transfer anything to these grafts. And the whole idea with grafting is for, really for human use. It doesn't necessarily improve them for wildlife, because nature's doing a pretty good job of that here. This was more like taking a wild tree. So you've got proven wild rootstock, a tree that's already 5, 6, 7, 8 feet tall, whatever, trim it back down to where you're above the deer, and then graft in a branch from a tree that has more favorable fruit. So we were putting in a lot of Enterprise, was the one that we settled on. And Enterprise tastes a lot better than some of these wild trees. There's a few of them here that are okay, for human consumption. They taste pretty good. And in fact, there's a couple trees here that taste really good, but most of them are they're not very good. They're bitter, or they're mushy, or whatever the problem is. The deer like them, but that's the whole point of grafting. We were trying to get more human use out of some of these wild trees, and you can see it didn't work very well for me last year. I've got this skid loader rented for 3 days, so I've got today and 2 more days. There's probably 500 trees here that I could pull the rows off, but you can see how well this process works. And I'm going to keep chipping away at it year by year until I finally get this entire wild orchard into shape. It's a learning process. Pick up a few tips here and a few tips there from people who have done this in the past, who have managed these types of areas. So the payoff is lots of food for the deer. I put a camera on one of these apple trees last year in September and let it run for about 2 weeks. And it was amazing how many times the deer came in there during the middle of the day to feed. It wasn't like evenings and mornings like you see out in the food plots, but they were all day long. Every hour of the day they were showing up in those spots looking for any fresh apples that might have fallen on the ground. So not only does it create a lot of food for the deer, but it creates a great hunting opportunity too. And that's what we're looking forward to. We've got a blind up the ridge a little ways. We're going to get this all into shape. And, there's a lot of work involved in everything that we do. And these wild orchards is no different, but the payoff is great. Well, I appreciate you joining me. I'll see you right back here again soon for the next episode of Dream Farm. And remember to always dream big.